Hello, everyone. I apologize for not posting for about 3 weeks. I recently gone through a very difficult time in my life, passing of a family member, and I didn't want to be over emotional while reading. But I will try my best to resume reading like I used to, and hopefully you guys still have an interest. If you guys want me to change books or anything else, just let me know. But let's get back to The Grand Escape. Chapter 19. Hunkered in the cornstalks, Jim Bennett listened to the distant voices of a search party and the barking of their dogs as they scoured the woods a quarter-mile away. Now and again, they drew closer to the field where he hid with Campbell Martin. A couple of horse-drawn carts carrying soldiers also passed on the nearby road. The escaped officers did not dare move during daylight hours. The hunt was intensifying, and, from previous experience, they knew that the German army would have informed the surrounding villages about the escape so civilians could join in the search, with police and military. Unless they put many miles between them and Holzheim, and soon the net would only tighten. Still, they remained in the fields, nervous and unable to sleep. Only when it was well after dark did they continue, moving through the forest as quickly and quietly as they could. It was a starless night, and they had trouble maintaining their compass course. They soon found themselves lost in a gully, forced to backtrack through the dark woods until they found the right path again. Just then, they spotted what they thought was a German soldier. They were trying to creep around him when he called out in English. It was Philip Murphy Smith, a 22-year-old Irish cavalry officer and member of the Rock. They greeted each other and continued on together. A small group started to head for Hummerson, down a road bordered by thick forests, when two men suddenly emerged from the trees in front of them. RNAS pilots Frederick Murdoch and Colin Lawrence. They informed them that Major Morrow was a short distance away as well. When he caught up with them, they numbered 7. The area was clearly alive with escaped prisoners. The men sat down in the woods to take a break. Morrow regaled with them of some of his adventures of the past few hours, including accidentally setting his entire tin of matches on fire, almost being found by a woman and her 2 children who were foraging in the woods where he lay naked while his clothes dried, and sleepwalking. He had woken up in the middle of the afternoon standing in a clearing in full view of anyone who might be there. His fellow officers laughed at these stories and had their own to tell too. Their voices and laughter grew louder and louder, and billows of cigarette smoke rose up from the huddle. Concerned, Morrow put an end to the gathering. It was too dangerous to travel in such a large pack, they decided. So the men split off from one another. They needed to put as much difference between themselves and Holzheim as possible. Kit bags over their shoulders, Gray, Kennard, and Blaine threaded their way through the dark, dense forest. They kept to a single file, ears keen for any sounds other than the call of night birds or the skitter of a squirrel through the underbrush. In his many years in the military, Gray had become a skilled orienter, and his steady compass bearing saved them from many misdirections and lost time suffered by their fellow fugitives. The 3 had started that day's march before dusk, balancing the risk of being seen before the benefits of getting beyond the 10-mile radius where they expected Neymar to concentrate his manhunt in the first 24 hours. They followed the roads where they could, and though they did not tend to be straight, and often led them towards hamlets or other towns they needed to avoid, shortly after midnight they reached Gellerson, roughly 15 miles from Holzheim. On the outskirts of the village, a farmer spotted the trio. Too late for them to turn back, hurry into the field, or find cover, they continued, hoping that the Gauersman Main Street would be abandoned at this hour, and other villagers they had passed that night had been. To their surprise, they found the opposite was true. Oil lamps flickered in the windows, and huddles of villagers stood outside, their cottages clearly disturbed. The three British airmen were sure that the news of Holzbein escape had reached Gallerson, and the villagers were stirred by the potential of an enemy loose in the area. It was time to see if Gray's scheme would fool anyone. But before reaching the first house, Kennard slipped his kit bag to Blaine. Then Blaine and Gray bookended Kennard, each putting a hand on his arm like they would if he was an actual asylum patient who might bolt off at any second. Occasionally Kennard tried to pull away from their grasp, and his two minders wrenched him back in line. Gray did not slow his pace or hesitate as they advanced down the street. Unless they were stopped, he did not intend to explain their presence. He was on official business, with the papers to back him up. Conversations halted, and they felt every eye on them as they passed. Whispers followed in their wake, and a parade of villagers trailed after them. There would be a confrontation for sure, but the closer they were to the far side of town, the better it would be if they had to make a run for it. At the time, Kennard struggled against the grip on his arms, occasionally rolling his eyes for good measure. When they reached the last cottage, a few villagers crossed over into their path and blocked their way. They stopped, and Gray drew his papers out from his pocket, set an interview card in the name of Fritz Vogel, and a letter stating his duties as chief guard at Wichita Insane Asylum. He told them in fluent German how the madman Kurt Guru had recently absconded from the asylum, tilting his head in the direction of his increasingly agitated charge. He added that he recommended they give them a wide berth. This had some effects on the villagers, but not enough for Gray. His charge was prone to convulsions, he said, and it looked and sounded like one was coming on. He requested some water so they could give him a quieting drug to calm him down. On cue, Kennard tried to break loose, a low growl rising from his throat. Blaine grabbed his arm and knocked him roughly on the side of the head. Gasps of shock rose from the villagers, and one ran off to fetch some water. Feeding on the reaction, Kennard whimpered and shook like he had no control of his limbs. Seemingly immune to his antics, Gray informed anyone listening that they could travel only by night, since encounters such as this would only set the lunatic off. When a villager brought a glass of water, Blaine put his hand out, stopping him. He leaned over to Gray and whispered, "No glass," Gray explained. "Guru might break it off and use the shards as a weapon." With that, they had the villagers completely fooled. A putrid mug of water was found while Kennard thrashed about like his tunic was on fire. They managed to wrestle him to the street, pinning him with his arms and legs. He only fought harder until a pill was forced between his lips and washed down with water. Sparing no drama, he writhed about. With every passing moment, he grew weaker, his twitches more spasmodic. At last, he grew still. The villagers were in a state of shock, but Gray promised them that the patient would awaken in a short while, no worse off than he was before. During the wait, he and Blaine enjoyed some wine, bread, and cheese donated by an elderly farmer, who clearly had taken seriously that the request in a letter from Veach's police of Chastity gives them all possible help. They also gained some valuable intelligence. A man was underway for some escaped POWs, and a company of soldiers was in the area. They were searching the countryside and guarding the road and railways line due north of Gallerson. When Kennard fluttered his eyelids awake, Glenn and Brain helped him up off the street, and they led their groggy patient away from the town. Once clear, they celebrated their success. Although Kennard lightheartedly bemoaned the clobbering he had received when they forced him down to the ground, he was especially disappointed that his minders had not saved him so much a crumb of fresh bread. By the morning of July 25th, nobody from the breakout had been caught, and Namor took his anger out on those who remained behind. He was furious when it was revealed that the tunnel entrance, the location, which was only discovered by digging up the entire length of the sap, had been right under the noses of the guards for months. His rage festered when crowds of Holzman residents came up to the camp to see the great tunnel and to wonder aloud how it could have gone unnoticed. A photographer even appeared to take pictures of the scar of unturned earth that led from a field to the eastern entrance of Block B. Namor was obsessed with recapturing all 29 of the escapees. Such a mass escape would only be an embarrassment to Germany, but no doubt more important than Namor, ruinous to his career. As part of his campaign to find them, he even posted notices in local and national newspapers asking for cooperation. We urgently request the help to get hold of all escaped officers in the interest of the defense of our country. We particularly call on the country's populations, berry pickers, hay collectors, youth military groups, hikers, and hunters to look out for anything suspicious. We know from experience that fugitives tend to hide in forests. At night, one should watch for any noise, or especially the barking of dogs in villages. A high reward is promised for assistance. The reward offered was 5,000 marks, a substantial sum in the war-torn Germany, for any information that led to the capture of Holzheim prisoner, dead or alive. On the afternoon of July 26, Rathbone arrived in Gotenhagen, a university town set on the river Lien. He was on his way into the town center, where he was expected to find a train station. He came across a tavern. Although he did want to try out his disguise, his decision to enter was far more on the account of his parched throat. He figured that as long as he kept any conversation brief, nobody realized that German was not his mother tongue. The tavern owner was an old woman who looked much part of the place as a scuffed bar. When she slid him a bottle of beer without remarking on his accent or appearance, Rathbone was reassured that he could successfully pass himself off as German. He had drunk fine quality draughts of beer in the past, in Berlin and in Munich, but no beer in his lifetime had ever tasted better than the one that afternoon. After leaving the tavern, Rathbone walked on, but without a map on the town, he soon found himself lost in a tangle of streets. With their half-timbered houses and steepled churches, it would not do to ask for directions. Finally, he saw a sign pointing to the railway station and made his way there. The train was not until 8 p.m. Not wanting to be loitering, he went back into town and bought a ticket for the cinema. The film was a memorial, but the newsreel, which showed a macabre scene of the Kaiser's soldiers standing over the bodies of Allied soldiers. Kaiser soldiers standing over the bodies of Allied soldiers. Rathbone's comrades struck him deep to the core. The word seemed to such a remove when he was in prison. Minutes before 8 p.m., he returned to the station and boarded his train. From his comfortable seat, he watched the fields and hills he had marched through that morning blend past behind his windows. After the annex in Gelston, Gray, Blaine, and Kennard found a copse of trees, and they got some sleep. They rarely left the woods after sundown on July 25th, when they spotted a company of soldiers and scrambled back into the trees to hide. The soldiers were so close, the three officers could see their boot laces as they passed. Gray leaned from their conversation from that another patrol had arrested an escaped prisoner farther down the road. There was nothing they could do to help him. After the soldiers were gone, Blaine struck his lighter and Gray examined the map. Every alteration of their route was later compromised. A long distance weighed against a small risk of encountering another patrol, moving quickly along the road against the safer but more taxing option of a hike through the countryside. They decided to strike through some fields, a circle around the soldiers, and then across a well-hidden stretch of road. Then they marched on a northwestern course, sometimes cutting through the farms and forested hillsides, other times keeping to the winding roads. Every couple hours, they took a break and smoked a cigarette, hands cupped over the end so the orange glow was not seen in the dark. At sunrise the next day, as they neared Hohenhausen, they had the advantage of some dense woods, and so they decided to hike through the daylight hours. For the next 2 nights, much of the hours were spent in a steady downpour. There were not main roads to follow. They took a yeoman's road, down county lanes and muddy paths, halting often when they saw soldiers and civilians, clearly part of the manhunt. They never stopped for any length of time, knowing well that a tracker or bloodhound might be closing in on their trail. The patter of the rain was their only cover. Every blind turn down a track or into a gully left their breaths trapped in their throats. Their limited meals and constant thirst exhausted them. But the prospect of someone coming upon them at any moment without warning was even worse. The few confrontations they had, the better their odds. Their lunatic cover story might convince or it might not. As the bright red dawn of Sunday, July 28th, was breaking, they reached the outskirts of Exeter, only 36 miles from Holzheim, with many cutbacks of looping roads. They had trekked much further in their 5 nights of the run. They still had so much more to do. Chapter 20. In the next several days, Rathbone continued with his plan to crisscross Germany by train, taking third-class carriages on slow local trains that stopped in almost every town along the route. He knew that conductors and the police were much more rigorous in their inspections for express trains and better-class carriages than the ones he was on. A downside of third class, as well as the discomfort, was it was full of chatty passengers with too much idle time. One young girl prattled away from their entire journey. Another time, a German soldier on leave from the front carried on and on about the nefarious Brits. And Bebra, he went to rest outside the town, finding a spot in the sack of corn. After a late breakfast of beer, listening to the bitter complaining from his waitress about the shortage of potatoes, he returned to the station and headed on to Fudla. His train came in too late for him to go straight to Cologne, so he bought a ticket to Frankfurt. On arrival there, he cleared out the station as quickly as he could, to avoid any chance encounters with the authorities. His grey suit was dirty, but it was nothing compared to his white shirt, which was so soiled he might have spent the night in the coal mine. He stopped in a tailor's shop to replace it, but when asked what size he needed, he could only stare blankly and make a fast exit. He had no knowledge whatsoever on German collar sizes. There was more trouble when he went to eat dinner at a restaurant. The Gaulois owner remarked that he could not quite place Rathbone's accent. The British officer replied that he was Polish by birth, but he did not stay for dessert in case he was asked any more questions about his background. He spent the next couple hours in the cinema before it was time for his overnight train to Cologne. He slept fitfully on the 100-mile journey, coming to the station on Sunday morning. Cologne was in a sorrowful state. Most shops were shuttered, and those that were open, butchers, bakers, and grocers, had long lines snaking out of their doors. The faces of the streets wore a forlorn gaze, and men, both young and old, hobbled past with war injuries. Concerned about his appearance, Rathbone visited a barber for a shave and a haircut. His next train to Aachen, a small town a mere 5 miles from the Dutch frontier, departed that evening. He spent the afternoon in parks, beer halls, and the cinema, having become an expert in whittling away the hours, seen but unseen, a travel-weary businessman who just wanted to get home. At 9 a.m., 2 hours after his train rumbled out of Cologne, Rathbone arrived in Aachen. He hopped on a tram that terminated at the Ponte, a medieval gateway northwest of the old city center. From there, he walked to the town outskirts. He had a meal and a glass of gin at a small bar, fortifying himself for the last leg of the escape. Then he hid out behind a railway embankment. With a map and compass in hand, he charted a route to the border that stayed clear of any roads or villages. At 11:30 p.m., the sky completely dark. He stashed his valise by the embankment and started west. He had only gone a short distance and was walking through some cornfields when a steady rain started to fall. The pitter-patter masked the sound of the stalks cracking underfoot. For an hour, he pushed his way through the crops. All of a sudden, a pack of dogs started barking. Rathbone dropped down and lay flat, sure the dogs were close enough to sniff him out. When the dogs quietened, he heard the voices of soldiers. For a long while, he remained absolutely still as the rain soaked through his clothes, leaving his skin cold. Neither the barking nor the voices came any closer. He decided to move ahead. He crawled on his hands and knees, fallen cord stalks cutting his palms as he went. He heard soldiers now and again, but decided his best option was to continue. He was uncertain about how far he had gone. With the dense stalks, he was slowly going. On and crawled, hoping that the border would come before the sentries pounced. He had to be close. On their own, or in bands of 2s or 3s, many of the escaped officers were recaptured and returned to Holzheim. Captain Frank Shape and Lieutenant Bernard Lusky Numbers 28 and 29 were out of the tunnel, were the first to come back through the gates. Namor glowered at them as they passed. The two men had made their preparation and only a slim head start before the tunnel was discovered. Soldiers nabbed them 15 miles down the river, on the banks of the Weser, which the return of each tunneler, the mood among the rest of the Holzheim prisoners darkened. Would not any manage their home run to Holland? Although filthy and stinking, Sharp and Luscombe were sent immediately to the cellars. No water to wash, no change of clothes were offered, and they were put on bread and water. Namor followed them down to the solitary in a venomous mood. He took Sharpie's gold watch and put it on the table. Using a knife, he stabbed and crushed the precious heirloom into pieces. Then he ordered the guard to tear the civilian outfits Sharp and Luscombe were wearing into ribbons. The two were left half naked. Namor gave strict orders that nobody was to communicate with him nor provide any additional food. As far as he cared about, they could rot. Others soon joined them. The police, soldiers, bloodhounds, all sent out on a manhunt, had less impact than the countless German citizens who had been summoned. Whether out of patriotism or greed for the award, they were incredibly effective. Butler, the first out of the tunnel, was nabbed in a village after he stole a bicycle. Others were flushed out of the fields or taken while lost at crossroads. By Monday, July 29th, 10 out of the 29 escapees had been returned to the camp. Their sorry state, grubby outfits, shallow faces, body wasted from lost food, only darkened the mood further. Morale among the prisoners deflated. It looked like none of the fugitives would make it to Holland. With each recapture, Namor swelled in his blue greatcoat. Never one to let good fortune pass without boasting about his own hand in it. He invited in reporters to chronicle each one. He wrote down what Namor dictated, with embellishments of color. Without expectation, Namor insisted. The prisoners only succeeded in their escape because of British accomplices outside of the camp. There was an army of spies in the vicinity, he claimed. There was no end to their supplies of clothing, food, and intelligence. Try as Namor did to wring the confession from the captured escapees, not one of them admitted to even using the tunnel, let alone having dug it. His attempts to befriend and bribe the orderlies, cash included, to get them to spill the conspiracy and say who was involved, also failed. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Strobes Roberts, senior officer since the departure of Rathbone, believed that the mass escape would surely see Namor removed from his position, but when General Hashing sent an officer to investigate the events, he made clear that Namor would stay. No crime of war or level of incompetence seemed capable of dislodging that bully from power. Namor's inquiries and his abuse of the returned prisoners stirred the pot of rebellion throughout Holzheim. One day the officers lit cigarettes and pipes at roll call, which was not allowed. A thick cloud of tobacco smoke billowed around the Spielplatz. Another day, they refused to answer their names at roll call. Another, they came out bare-chested. Each time Namor sent in his guards to herd them back into the barracks, each time with a little more violence. So many prisoners had been arrested for violations that they eventually had to be housed in the town jail. But looking at where the escapees had been caught, Namor had a bead on the remaining men's westward line of flight. Holzheim, Boulderwede, Helmand, Loin, Bielefeld, Arnis, Granu, and on to the Dutch border. He focused his attention on seeing his fugitive prisoners returned, directing the search himself and calling for local assistance along the route. Even if the prisoners did find their way to the border, he knew well that they would be bedragged and half-starved. The German sentries would find them easy pickings, and his record might yet go unblemished. The easy escape of the exhausted Jack Morrow by the Ems River was a sign of this truth. The easy capture. By August 15th, prisoners were still on the run, but Holland was a far way off, and Namor was confident that he could win in the end. That one day he received a random telegram sent from Holland. It was written by one Lieutenant Colonel Charles Rathbone. It said, "Having a lovely time. Stop. If I ever find you in London, we'll break your neck. Stop." The first of the breakout artists had made it. Well, that's definitely one way to say, screw you, I'm better. Chapter 21. Dogs were barking in the village of Twiesheisen. but the surrounding fields were too thick with mud to allow Gray, Kennard, and Blaine to circumvent the hamlet. Rain poured down from the sky. They thought they wouldn't be any trouble passing unnoticed through the single lane of cottages in the middle of the night. But with every step they took, another dog howled in one of the cottages. They would have a better chance of tiptoeing through a kennel with stakes around their necks. A few more cottage doors opened, and villagers peered out to see what was causing the ruckus. Earlier in their journey, they might have hurried along or not risked going through the hamlet in the first place. But after more than a week, without proper rest, hiking miles every day, sleeping outdoors and eating half rations and wearing damp clothes, they were cavalier. At last they cleared the village, the cacophony from the dogs fading in the distance. Nobody had stopped them that time, but the three knew that it only took a single mistake, the misreading of a sign, a careless hiding spot, and an inquisitive passerby, and it would all be lost. The next night they trudged through the swamp that encircled much of the Doomer Lake. Bedeviled by mosquitoes, by the time they reached dry land, they were covered in bites. It was almost dawn on August 1st, but they continued until they had gone around the town of Dam. Each one of their 11-miles hurt. At last they hid in some woods to rest, the afternoon sun blazing overhead. They barely grunted in conversation. They were so hungry and tired. During their almost 2 years of captivity, they had all lost weight. But after the past 8 days of strain, half rations, and limited water, they were like skeletons. Their clothes hung loose on their frames. Their eyes stared listlessly, and they were all suffering from colds. Blaine's cheeks were sunken. He looked twice his age. After dusk, they pushed through their exhaustion and marched down the road to Due south of their route was Unishbrook, which was the first where they had first banded together to escape. They felt like a lifetime ago. They had covered 16 miles that night, but their ambition stopped too late to find anywhere other than a narrow thicket and trees in which to hide. By their map, Gray determined that they were roughly 45 miles from Sellingen, the Dutch border town, and that they should make their cross to freedom in 4 nights. They had rations enough for only 2. Determination would need to cover the rest. The next 24 hours followed much the same, sleeping in a long, slow trudge, one foot after another. In the late hours of Saturday, August 3rd, near the hamlet of Weest, the road took a sharp turn away from their steady northward course. They had left its easy track for a tramp through the dark marsh, their boots sticking in the mud. The only sounds in the night were their grunts of exertion and the sucking sound of the mud taking hold of each step. They did not have the energy to speak. Over a dozen miles after they began, they collapsed in some woods again. Yet, before daybreak, they slept soundly. Then, once dusk settled over the countryside, they began yet another trek. They passed through cultivated farmland from time to time, but their efforts to forage from the fields yielded nothing. The best nourishment they found was some rotten turnips that turned their stomachs, and raw potatoes. They were better for cracking teeth than eating. Before morning, they intended to cross a point where the Ems River and the canal meet. They swim alone was enough to occupy their fears. Southwest of Blenheim, perched high in the branches of a tree, Jim Bennett watched German soldiers go in and out of a camp just 300 yards away. It was one thing to see the Dutch border on the map, quite another to see its exact location and surroundings, and to determine the best place to cross. Armed sentries report the 350-mile border between Germany and the Netherlands. But there was no high wall, no single line of defense. In some places there was handmade earthen embankments. In others, a canal or road separated the two countries. Sometimes electrified fences or barbed wire divide woods and open fields. There was also stretches where it was impossible to know what country you were in until you saw a guard or sentry post. In many senses, the border's regularity, often dictated by the terrain, was its own defense. The longer you spent looking for an undefended spot, the more likely you were to be caught by a roving patrol or a farmer who would like to be rewarded handsomely for your return. Early that morning, Bennett and Caleb Martin had taken cover in the tree's dense foliage. By observing the movements of the frontier sentries, they had a good idea where the border line lay. They figured their best opportunity was to run through some nearby woods. The day passed intermediately. There was nothing for them to do but watch the guard and try to forget how thirsty and hungry they were. They had eaten the last scraps of their food. And connoisseurs for puddle water. Were desperate for something fresh to drink. Late in the day, a storm settled over them, turning the sky black. Rain beat down through the leaves, and thunder cracked and boomed in every direction. It was faintly dark, and they had set out early, but the clouds broke and the sun shone brightly again. So they waited in their perch until the sun set and the night stole completely over the countryside. The two men then dropped down to the ground, fixed their compasses for southwest, and started off across the moor. Thoughts coursed through Bennett's head about what might prevent him from reaching freedom. Electrified fences, dogs, burly sentries, and he figured out how he would overcome each. Only a bullet would need to stop him setting foot in Holland before dawn the next day. Maybe not even that. When they reached the woods, where they believed the border to be, they dropped to their hands and knees and continued at a crawl. The rain had done little to dampen the crackle of leaves and twigs. It seemed the closer they got to where the border was located, the more noise they made. A few minutes later, Bennett spotted the line of barbed wire fence. The border, 100 yards away at most. A lone sentry stood between them and freedom. They straightened up and eased slowly forward towards the trees, grabbing heavy branches and sticks in case it came to a struggle. As yet, they had not seen any dogs, nor had they heard barking. Then, all of a sudden, there was a rustle in the woods a short distance away. Bennett stopped cold, and Campbell Martin drew up alongside him. For a long moment, the two waited. All was silent, but Bennett sensed someone in the darkness ahead, someone restless and on alert. He was sure of it. He advanced. There was no turning back now. He only gone a few steps when he heard the distinct cocking of a rifle and the sound of its butt being brought quickly to its owner's shoulder. "Halt!" a German sentry ordered. Bennett and Campbell Martin knew what they had to do. They barely gave each other a look before they charged straight through the trees of the sentry, their sticks at the ready. Their sudden movement shocked the soldier, and he stood frozen as Bennett swept past, running so fast he didn't have time, nor the need, to use his stick. Campbell Martin followed close behind him. They found a break in the barbed wire fence and ran through it. "Halt!" the sentry called again. The crack of a rifle echoed behind as they charged headlong in Holland. The first shot, then next, missed. They ran and ran until they splished into the Dinkel River in free Holland. On the opposite bank, they collapsed and shook hands. Together, both at the same time, they said, "We've made it!" And that is chapter 21. I will read more tomorrow, but thank you all for listening, and hopefully you all have an amazing day. Good night.